The Talk Shop.
Good evening and welcome to the special broadcast of The Talk Shop. We are coming to you live from UNISA. We are at the ZK Matthews Great Hall in Pretoria and we are attending the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture. And of course this is SAFM 104 to 107 and I am Masechaba Mushweshwe. Welcome. Tonight at the lecture, the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, we are looking at guests like Dr. Mongani Waliserote, former CEO of Freedom Park, chairperson of the NYDA, Andy Lungisa is also here. And I'm sure you heard in the news from Grikhos that expelled Youth League President Julius Malema, together with his spokesperson Floyd Chivambo, is also here. And they were greeted with applause when they entered the hall. The ambassador, Dumisani Khumalo, former South African rep to the United Nations and current Thabo Mbeki Foundation CEO, is also here tonight, as well as the former minister and current trustee of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Aziz Bahad, together with his brother, former Minister Isop Bahad, and former Deputy President of South Africa, Madam Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, also present here tonight, as well as Reverend Dr. Frank Chikani, who is the former DG in the presidency and also author of 8 Days in September, and the leader of the IFP, Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, also here tonight. Currently, as we speak, the Reverend Canon, Professor Bani Bijana, who is a member of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation Board of Trustees, is on stage, and he is giving an introductory statement of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, and proceedings are being directed by Dr. Brigalia Bam. The panel discussion will consist of 4 former presidents. Olusegun Obasanjo, former president of Nigeria, is here. He is said to be someone who is one of the African statesmen that has continued to dedicate his time to the development of the continent, and he recently led a joint AU-ECOWAS high-level mission to oversee the Senegalese elections. Also forming part of the panel tonight is former president of Cape Verde, His Excellency Pedro Pires, and he was Prime Minister of Cape Verde from 1975 to 1991, and he went on to become President of his party in 1997 and won in the 2000 elections and then again in the 2006 elections. Also part of the panel tonight is His Excellency Joaquim Chissano, who is former president of Mozambique, and he currently chairs the Joaquim Chissano Foundation and the Forum of Former African Heads of State and Government, and of course South Africa's former president, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, also here, patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, and he's currently chair of the African High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan and also chair of the recently launched UN Economic Commission for Africa panel on illicit outflows of capital from Africa. The panel discussion will be facilitated by Professor Chris Landsberg, who is from the University of Johannesburg. He currently teaches undergraduate and postgraduate modules in foreign policy analysis. So this is an annual lecture of a different kind, of a different form, as opposed to a keynote speaker who addresses everyone on the theme of the day. Tonight we are looking at former presidents coming together to talk about Africa, the theme being Africa and the New World Order, challenges and opportunities. Of course, we cannot overlook the fact that this year marks the 10th year anniversary of the formation of the African Union. The African Union was formed in 2002 in Durban, and of course 2002 was also the year the G8 adopted an action plan on Africa. Of course, the global economic crisis saw Africa being pushed to the periphery of world affairs. Thus the theme, Africa and the New World Order, challenges and opportunities. Looking forward to hearing from the former presidents with regards to their views on how Africa can rise to the occasion, how the African agenda can continue to dominate or at least take center stage when we're looking at world affairs, and of course how Africa can speak with one voice to push the African agenda. We've seen a lot of dissent with regards to a way forward by countries that form part of the African Union. These are the issues and themes that are expected to dominate and to come out tonight and form part of the talks between the former presidents. We are talking about 4 former presidents of Africa coming together, talking about the African agenda. This is all happening at the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture taking place in Pretoria at the UNISA campus at the ZK Matthews Great Hall. And of course, tomorrow is Africa Day, and thus the Africa Day lecture forming part of the celebrations of Africa Day across the country. Right now, speaking is, as I said earlier on, Reverend Canon Professor Bani Bijana, talking about the foundation itself, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, as he is a member of the Board of Trustees.
The positivists of that time understood that they had to be informed and knowledgeable about their reality. They had to understand the strengths of their people, including their histories and cultures, and then they could call on the sacrifices of their people on the basis of a shared vision for the future. What Archie Mafeja observed is a truism, that intellectual cycles in Africa have a very short lifespan. The onset of liberation was driven by a fervor for Pan-Africanism and a new deal for Africa. And within a space of about 5 years, we were in the horrors of military dictatorships and one-party states and authoritarian rule. That was a time that saw the flight of African intellectual capital and the destruction of universities, an ideology that was fueled more by the East-West ideological conflicts, and Africa became the theater of struggle of the elephants, and the grass that suffers were the ordinary people of the continent. In some ways, the establishment of the OAU in 1963 brought promise of African solidarity and a common struggle against colonialism. Now, 50 years later, colonialism retreated from Africa with the defeat of apartheid in South Africa. But more and more dangerous forms of neocolonialism hover menacingly above Africa's horizon. But we do well to remember that time in 1963 as the beginnings of Africa's rites of passage, from a state of innocence to one of experience. Perhaps the period between 1963 and 2002, the birth of the African Union, could be the middle passage of a kind. The end of this period, however, was presenting Africa with a new set of challenges. For one thing, international affairs were taking a drastic turn, both in terms of the geopolitical environment as well as the emerging expressions of the world order and development. The then prevailing partnerships with failed African states was under strain. Secondly, in Africa itself, there were emerging new leaders, some of whom were without roots in the independence struggles, and they were raising new questions about Africa's responsibilities for her own history and future. With the death of apartheid, Africans could then attend to a new set of challenges about their relations among themselves and the legacy of the colonial past that divided Africa into spheres of influence. Within Africa, there was a restive populace that was asking some hard questions about the nature of Africa's democracy and the demands for a new philosophy of rights and democracy and a new philosophy of leadership. I suggest, therefore, that much of what Africa had been about was no longer adequate. In this environment, autocratic generals turned civilian rulers were always going to arouse suspicion, and that the democratic ideal in Africa would remain inchoate, and the democratic push would be relentless. At a philosophical level, this, I suggest, meant that African studies were having to raise old questions afresh, but with increased determination. The social and historical method was under renewed interrogation. The application of Western paradigms of knowledge in Africa was proving inadequate to address the mood then prevailing in the continent, and it had become necessary for African intellectuals to reconstruct an Africa and its thought structures. In the postmodernist and reconstructive environment, the validity of the theoretical conclusions had to be reevaluated in the light of new understandings about and in whose service they had been developed or served. and indeed how the interests of Africa had been subordinated to Western interests. Within that paradigm, it was urgent that the character of the power relations formed as a result of the theoretical preconceptions needed to be unraveled. And so Ren Grinstein puts it, that although objective truth cannot be achieved, one can strive for detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic, and cultural, within which it operates at the present time, unquote. In other words, power relations were being exposed for what they were, and new relations of power constructed with, hopefully, a fulcrum set in the African idea. With that also, there had to be a renewed African idealism that the philosopher rulers of the past had managed to instill in Africa, but to search for a more lasting idealism in the face of challenges by a variety of power interests. A search for explanations was therefore underway, rather than absolutes and certainties. The truth was that Africa needed to establish new foundations and boundaries of knowledge about herself, buffeted by a world of ideas determined to exploit and mine whatever could be of benefit to other nations. From the point of view of historical social science, Achima Fedje, in a celebrated essay that established the mood at this time, tries to discover whether there is any quality and capacity of intellectual participation in Africa that could unearth the possibility of the possible, of the impossible. He held that philosophical and social revolutions are contingent on scientific revolutions. Therefore, in his view, there had to be a marriage between Africa-specific science and science that determines socio-political activity. Africans cannot possibly build Africa on the basis of ideas generated from outside of its own history, culture, and politics. He also makes a telling point. He also makes the telling point that whatever we might believe about the independence and origins of social scientific thought, it is invariably a product of its own social circumstances. Social thought emerges out of and with the social revolutions of her time, which it may interrogate, shape, and challenge. He then concludes, and I quote, "For the social scientists, artists, and philosophers, the intellectual task of identifying, evaluating, and synthesizing popular cultural notions, various progressive nationalist and socialist preconceptions, and demands is a Herculean task, but not impossible. A beginning has been made. Might not," he concludes, "the African twilight have come for aspirant radical African intellectuals to take off?" The point one makes here is that however imperceptibly the emergence of South Africa into the African governance system and culture of ideas unleashed a new energy and idealism into the African consciousness about herself and about her place in world affairs. It was therefore not surprising that the period since 1994 saw the flowering of new developments and new life into the OAU and Africa, among whom was the democratization and human rights ideals, the legitimacy of elections and electoral processes, the need to take control and amass Africa's intellectual capital, and migrate artifacts and cultural pieces in various capitals of the world, and to appreciate Africa's own historical and cultural and scientific resources. The genius of this, for a time at least, was that strident Pan-Africanist calls were not directed, in my view, at Africa's historical exploiters, but at the predilection for Africa to surrender her pride and value in the form of oppressive and hegemonic relations. I suggest that NEPAD was an early collaborative endeavor that reflected this new thinking, a pledge, as the NEPAD Declaration puts it, I quote, by African leaders based on a common vision and a firm and shared conviction that they have a pressing duty to eradicate poverty and to place their countries, both individually and collectively, on a path of sustainable growth and development, and at the same time, to participate actively in the world economy and body politic, unquote. One guesses that we sensed at this point that the African Renaissance ideal had become real and concrete and material. And this raised the hopes of the critical intellectual community in Africa and abroad. By this initiative, I suppose, one could observe that African intellectual leadership was able to partner with and recognize the intellectual resources that Africa was capable of, and to manage those collectively for the greater good. This was a constructivist ideal on the phenomenon of globalization that was then prevalent, and to manage it for Africa's benefit. Tade Akin Aina, in the introduction to the book he co-edited with Seithi El Shashaj and Elizabeth Anna Yao, Globalization and Social Policy in Africa, published by Codesria, observed that with the malaise of the years of Africa in doldrums and a prolonged state of crisis had been, and I quote, not only the delegitimization and undermining of the African state and the erosion of its capacity to provide basic and other forms of services, but also the emergence of a form of social consciousness that denies the validity and relevance of both social policy in the development processes and the development process itself as a key element of social transformation, unquote. In this, of course, Aina refers to some of the World Bank positivist economics of development in Africa that stunted development and social change to a considerable extent. More seriously, behind this, he is bemoaning the extent to which Africa outsourced responsibility for her own development. NEPAD sought to reverse this. But the development process, to be transformative, has to be owned by Africans and serve the needs of the most needy of Africa's peoples. Hence, Amartya Sen refers to this challenging, holistic and transformatory development as the ideal that benefits the livelihoods of the people. And he says, and I quote, eliminate poverty and advance emancipation from domination, social economic injustice and inequality. Sen's notion of development is both freedom and the exercise of free choice by the beneficiaries in the development cycle. NEPAD recognized through the African peer review mechanism that development must go hand in hand with human freedoms and capacity, as well as the accountability of states. We have every reason, therefore, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the African Union. That is because, in large measure, Africa has proved skeptics wrong. Wrong about the determination of Africa to take charge of her own affairs and to sustain mutually accountable democracy and human rights, however imperfect, and to drive her own development agenda and set in place mechanisms for the management of conflicts. For good reason, therefore, does one apply Aina's conclusion that, and I quote, the struggle for good governance and basic rights and the establishment of sustainable and relevant economic development strategies that include frameworks geared towards building and rebuilding institutions, recovering people's self-confidence, and renewing social integration and social justice have been the focus of attention of the African Union since its establishment. Mafeja, therefore, was wholly correct to say that the cycle of African intellectual and historical activity is but brief spans of time. To put it mildly, we are perhaps experiencing a lull in these matters in Africa today. It is hard to understand how it was that in Côte d'Ivoire and now Guinea-Bissau in Mali, Africa appears to have surrendered initiatives to France and other international bodies to maintain her claims to colonial, cultural, and political confidence on Africa. It is conceivable that failure by Africa to take collective, decisive action in Côte d'Ivoire fueled and encouraged adventurism by the military men. Madagascar, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger. It may well be true also that the rumbling Arab Spring developed to the extent it did, and with the consequences that followed, precisely because after years of misrule and kleptocratic states, there was no confidence that any of the African processes would ever bring relief or meaningful change. I suspect that we would have been in a similar situation in Zimbabwe and Kenya had not timely interventions materialized. Whether that is to be regretted or not is debatable. The lesson, it seems to me, is that Africa must listen to the voices of the people of Africa and deem it necessary to take active steps within the provisions of the Constitutive Act of the African Union and the mechanisms of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. To conclude, I come back to the notion I introduced from Plato at the start of this address. It is that leaders should be men and women of reason, who are qualified and capable of holding their own in world affairs, and to be trusted and trustworthy in their dealings with people and resources. There is most likely to be a tendency from leaders who are without intellect to also lack in moral fiber. Because they fail to understand the limitations of governance, but also that they may be incapable of drawing from their own capabilities to provide the nation with a new, compelling, and confident vision of itself and of their idealism, to be at times above the fray and help guide the nation in its most difficult moments. I had just left Mumbai in India the day in 2008 when the terrorist attack took place. I must say that it still sounds very strange for me to say that word for some reason. I always try to find another word for it, but that's what it was called. I watched from our hotel room in Hyderabad the helter-skelter manner in which the aftermath of the attack was handled. Clearly failure of intelligence, lack of readiness by security forces, and some indifference and even cynicism. These things happen, said one official, about the consequences of inaction or prevaricating when Rome was literally burning. This got many Indian people very angry. Yes, angry against the terrorists, but increasingly volubly angry against their own government. I read a few days later in the International Herald Tribune a feature article analyzing the effect of the attack on the psyche of the people of Mumbai. It was suggested that in India, for far too long, the educated elite and the intellectuals had shied away from taking an active part in politics and considered it not to be worthy of their consideration, either because politicians were those who had been failures in society or were undereducated lower classes. And so prestige for them went into business, the arts, including films, and of course indulging in lifestyles of affluence and speculative theorizing about this and that. The report suggested that Mumbai was a wake-up call. Indifference was no longer cool, because indifference had meant death. It said that the educated, intellectual, and elite classes could no longer outsource politics to the mediocre and the incompetent without consequence. And as such, says Anand Giridharadas in this feature article, galvanized by attacks, the apathetic elite rise up. There was a sudden allure and sentimentalism about the good old days of the failed idea that India be run by its brightest and not its dullest bulbs. Emmanuel Chupudi Eze, in his book Memory, Reason and Politics, says, "The defense of reason and its justice will be valid, even when it is acknowledged that modernity's industrial and commercial reason is merely an imperfect version of possible historical ideals. In fact, this potential in the capacity to conceive such better reasons accounts for the necessity for such historical critique of reasons of the present. Far from dogmatic or conservative, this is a critical, progressive theory of rationality." He argues that this remains true even in cases where men and women of reason fail to exercise their faculties of reason, or to become dogmatic and resort to tyranny. It is not because of reason that they so behave, but because they shall have abandoned reason. I do not accept the stereotype that reason is heartless or that rationality is without feeling, without soul. On this understanding, there can be no reason without soul, because the soul does not dance and float about, detached from the mind. The worst situation, argues Plato, though, is when a ruler devoid of a philosophical mind, of decency in judgment, and arbitrary and irrational in the exercise of power, but relies solely on self-interest to justify his actions. And I quote, "Often he will take to politics, leap to his feet and do or say whatever comes to his head, or he conceives an admiration and his interests are in war, or for a man of business, and straightway that is his line. He knows no order or necessity in life, but he calls life as he conceives it, pleasant and free and divinely blessed, and is ever faithful to it," unquote. I plead, therefore, that Africa may never abandon her appreciation and understanding of quality in leadership. Strive for nothing short of excellence rather than mediocrity, and for visionary and ethical leaders. It is perhaps going too far to suggest that we are in a quagmire because we have managed to substitute reason and people consciousness for self-interest, public service for personal aggrandizement, ethics for absence of integrity and opportunism, honest dealing in public life and being trustworthy for corruption and entrench a get-rich-quick culture. And yet, we the people only wish to be governed fairly and justly. We wish to have conditions created for self-development, and we aspire to be no more than fully human with rights and dignity that we owe to no one. And above all, we strive simply to be African and to proudly shout, "I am an African," with President Thabo Mbeki. Thank you.
The Talk Shop.
This is the Talk Shop with me, Masachaba Mushweshwe, on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. This is a special broadcast of the Talk Shop coming to you from UNISA, the ZK Matthews Great Hall, where we are at attendance at the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture. The theme, Africa and the New World Order, Challenges and Opportunities. We've just been listening to the introductory speaker, Reverend Canon Professor Bani Pitjana, who is rector of the College of the Transfiguration, and he's also retired as principal and vice chancellor of UNISA. He retired in 2010. He's currently a member of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation Board of Trustees, and the logo of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation is dedicated to Africa's Renaissance. And this was the scene set by Professor Bani Pitjana when he spoke about the period of the struggle of the elephants, referring to the scramble for Africa. The question being now, is there not currently a struggle of the elephants taking place on our continent, attempts to recolonize Africa? And also he spoke about Africa determining new foundations and affirming African knowledge and science. And he spoke about the role of the social sciences, especially determining the African governance system and consciousness, and the need to amass Africa's intellectual capital, sciences and culture, and reiterated the NEPAD pledge, which is the common vision of African leaders to eradicate poverty and grow their economies. And he spoke about the concretization of the African Renaissance, how this NEPAD pledge concretized and materialized the African Renaissance to many people, and also the need for the transformation of Africa being owned by Africans themselves and buying in to the transformation and the Renaissance of Africa. He also mentioned that in India, the elite classes and intellectuals distanced themselves from political discourse, which resulted in death in the Mumbai bombings. And clearly there is a price to be paid for apathy. The question that we're asking tonight on the Talk Shop is, where are the African intellectuals? Why the deafening silence from our brightest, and we are taking your SMSs on 34701. SMS number is 34701. Question: where are the African intellectuals? What do you think? What discourse? How do you think? What different direction do you think that they'll take the current discourse on African leadership, on governance, political governance, economic governance? Will they take it in a new direction, or will they just keep on repeating what we keep hearing all the time from those who have stood up, the very, very few that have stood up to speak? Currently, the panel has embarked on the discussion, and the facilitator is Professor Chris Landsberg from the University of Johannesburg. Panel discussion consisting of 4 former presidents: former president of Mozambique, former president of Cape Verde, former president of South Africa, and the former president of Nigeria.
Just to articulate some of the views, we would really appreciate that. Now, on behalf of all 5 former heads of state. Sorry, I meant to say 4. 4.
Without waiting for a chair.
Not 5. 4. You have to forgive me. This is the closest ever I'll come to power, and I really. And I really plan to make the most of it. So the first instruction I want to give you: please turn off your cell phones. Or as they say in the airplane, put them on flight mode, please. Thank you very much. Just a couple of house rules. What we're going to do, I really would like this to become an evening where we have robust, free-flowing, very serious interactions and debates about our continent, the state of our continent, the place of our continent in the world, and indeed our responsibilities as Africans in turning our conditions around. The second point I'd like to make is that to the senior members in the audience, excellencies, dignitaries, I would like this to become an interaction the students will be glad to hear between young people tonight and our 4 former heads of state. How's that? Young people. There's just one golden rule, though. I'm going to ask you to be very crisp and short and to the point. Once again, President Pires, President Chisano, President Obasanjo, we welcome you to South Africa on behalf of President Mbeki and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, as well as UNISA. So why don't we start by me asking each president not so much to do a response to what Professor Bani Pichana said, because there were some really incisive and critical points made, but just a 2 to 3 point introduction, a statement to kick us off, whether you'd like to talk about the African condition, Africa's role in the world, issues of leadership, issues of institutions.
We are coming to you live from the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, and the question that we're asking tonight on the talk shop is: where are the African intellectuals? Why the deafening silence from our brightest? And we are taking your SMSs currently on 34701, 34701. Just a quick note that facilitator Chris Landsberg was setting out the terms of engagement tonight, not only for the panel but also for the audience, and he also asked the former presidents to comment on the speech made by the Reverend Canon Professor Bani Pichana, who was giving the introductory speech, and directed the first question to His Excellency Pedro Pires, former president of Cape Verde, who his interpreter obviously had to interpret for him, and also just to get clear the question that was asked by Professor Chris Landsberg. And we will be getting a response. We will take you back to the broadcast just for a quick response with regards to the question that was asked, their take on the speech given by Reverend Canon and Professor Bani Pichana. But we are taking your calls, your comments, your thoughts. The question we're asking tonight is, where are the African intellectuals? Why the deafening silence? But you don't necessarily have to stick to it. You can give us your thoughts on the speech that was made by Professor Bani Pichana, and also your thoughts on the African Renaissance and, of course, NEPAD and the role of Africa today. The theme of the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture for 2012 is Africa and the New World Order, Challenges and Opportunities. Maybe you want to delve into that. Very welcome to do so. SMS line 34701. SMS number is 34701. And you're also welcome to call us on 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207. I'm looking at some of the SMSs that are already coming in with regards to the lecture. One talking about, this one coming in from Joe, saying, I'm surprised that the SABC was not given a directive not to broadcast this lecture live by those who seem to be trying hard to erase President Mbeki from history. Joe, I will tell you that this was something that was planned well in advance, and of course the SABC is fully on board with it, and that is why we are broadcasting live as the talk shop from the lecture itself. Velile Dwaba says, I hope Jacob Zuma is taking notes on international politics. Those are some of the SMSs coming in relating to the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture. Another SMS says, we are the dead with our brains because money corrupts. We should and are obliged to defend Africa even on our knees like Lumumba. That is coming in from Siyanda in Dukuza, saying that money has seen our brightest and our intellectuals actually silent, even and not defending Africa as would be required or expected. We are going to go back. We're going back to the lecture just for a response from former President of Cape Verde, Pedro Pires.
Except from that,
this is his interpreter speaking.
We have the impression that we are consumers.
On consomme des produits manufacturés.
We are consuming products which have been manufactured.
On consomme les idées qui viennent d'ailleurs.
We consume ideas coming from elsewhere.
On consomme des commandements qui viennent d'ailleurs.
We consume orders coming from other parts of the world.
Et qu'on doit donc passer dans un stade de producteur.
We have to move from this stage to the stage of producers.
Produire les produits manufacturés, des automobiles, d'autres produits.
We have to.
Les TV, et d'autres produits, disons, hautement technologiques.
We have
en même temps produire des idées.
We have to become producers of every sort of manufactured goods, such as cars, technologies. We have to also become producers of ideas and solutions.
Pour cela, je voulais saluer la création, la Fondation Mbeki.
And for that, I would like to salute the creation of Mbeki Foundation.
J'espère et je souhaite qu'il soit un think tank pour penser les problèmes de l'Afrique du Sud, pour penser les problèmes de l'Afrique et ses défis, et pour penser les problèmes du monde actuel.
And I hope
ce monde avec tous ces défis, avec tous ces risques.
I hope this foundation will be a think tank to solve South African problems, African problems, international problems, and to face all the challenges with which we are confronted.
Nous avons besoin, je crois, c'est mon point de vue, de produire des opinions valables partout dans le monde.
we need to produce ideas which are worthwhile throughout the world.
Et pas seulement recevoir les opinions des grands penseurs hors de l'Afrique. Nous avons besoin de grands penseurs chez nous aussi. Pour moi, c'est le grand défi. Merci.
We don't have to be only on the receiving ends of ideas coming from outside. We must become generators of great ideas in Africa. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. President. Merci, Mr. President, and I won't go further than that, otherwise I'll expose my poor French. President Chisano, you're most welcome, sir.
I have the mic.
The mic, yeah.
Thank you very much. I have 3 minutes to speak. After hearing so many speeches, I have so many ideas coming to my head. And so I cannot really try to make sense of all what I'm going to say because my head is still boiling. Let me take the advantage that my elder brother, Pires, with whom we worked together since 1961, and we discussed about how we could participate in the liberation of our countries. Now, he started his speech by saying he is going to put 2 ideas. Well, maybe I will say also a few ideas, maybe 3. But as I said, if I arrive at the 3rd and then I'm excited to speak about the 4th one, you'll forgive me. Now, we are celebrating tomorrow the African or Organization of African Union. I think it's 49th anniversary. And when this date arrives, we have to think how things started. And the main speakers have reminded us all of that. But then we have to answer a question which is coming very often among the youth, but also among the not so young people. They ask, do you think it was worth it to fight? It was worth it to fight. You were in the liberation movements. And some put it differently. They say, was it necessary really to fight? To answer to that, one has to try and think about how Africa was yesterday, how Africa was in 1963, and think how Africa is today. Look at us in this room. I even don't see today many white faces.
Yeah, some.
I know, I see them here. I say many. But in 63, I don't know how it would have been in an university like this. I was today in Stellenbosch, but not at the university. But the place itself tells everything, what that university looked like. How does it look like today? So, but we find this question comes, Was it necessary to fight? Was it worth fighting? Do you think that this is the Africa our forefathers, the founders of OAU, thought that we want to build? Is this Africa? So the tendency is to think about the bad things. What is wrong? What is wrong? What is wrong? But I think that in days like today, when we celebrate the OAU 49th anniversary and the 10th anniversary of African Union, we should try to be proud. There's a lack of pride of the good things which Africa has achieved. And we should think about our achievements. There are plenty. There are many things of tendency by the press from somewhere trying to think to give us the impression that Africa is a lost continent. But when I see all these students here, when I see all these professors here, and those who eloquently spoke, I say Africa is not a lost continent. Africa is the continent of the future. The other thing is that we don't have confidence on ourselves. But Pires has already spoke about that. We don't have confidence that we can build, we can do things. These two gentlemen here, Olusegun Obasanjo and Mbeki, they tried to bring us this idea of new partnership for development of Africa. And many of us misunderstood them. And we thought that they were saying new partnership between Africa and Europe for the development of Africa. But they were saying new partnership because we are partnering first among ourselves in Africa. So that we liberate Africa. As Pires said, we have to be confident. But there's a lack of confidence. I would like the youth to be confident. Well, it's not because he's an American that I'm not going to repeat what he said, but he's half African. He said, you can.
Yes, you can.
Yes, we can. But this lack of confidence makes us to repeat only what the other people like us to say. There's shortcomings, there are mistakes in Africa. We should not ignore them, but we should make sure that it's we who are going to bypass mistakes and bring new things. The third thing which I would like to touch on is this question of democracy. Today, when we speak about democracy, we say that Africa is working up towards democracy.
The former president of Mozambique, His Excellency Joaquim Chissano, currently responding to the question that was posed by the facilitator, Chris Landsberg, with regards to his views on the speech that was made by Reverend Canon Professor Bani Pijana, and he talks about the lack of African pride and confidence as Africans that we can create, and the misunderstanding with regards to the new Africa vision, the perception being that it should be Africa and Europe, and he says that the partnership, it should be and is amongst Africans first. He continues to answer the question posed, and after he responds, we can expect the response of former President Olusegun Obasanjo, and of course the former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, will also respond.
The Talk Shop.
This is the Talk Shop with me, Master Chaba Mushweshwe, on SAFM 104 to 107. We are coming to you live from the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture at the Great Hall, the ZK Matthews Great Hall at UNISA, and where the 4 former presidents of African countries are on stage. They form part of a panel discussion talking about Africa. The theme, Africa and the New World Order, Challenges and Opportunities. Former President of Mozambique, His Excellency Joaquim Chissano, spoke about democracy not being foreign to Africa, and the existence of African democracy being there even during the times of the chiefs and kings, and he asked for affirmation about this from the head of the IFP, Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and he also went on to talk about democracy being participation from all sectors of society and part of African culture, and he also spoke about the need for culture evolving and how we must work at perfecting democracy as an African nation, tying into his talk around lack of African pride earlier on. Just looking at some of the SMSs coming in from you, the question that we asked earlier on is, where are the African intellectuals? Why the deafening silence from our brightest? And of course the SMS number is 34701, and Nkobani in Polokwane says, what avenues are opened to broad African intellectuals to deposit and share their intellect with the rest of Africa? Sipo says the educated and intellectual were recalled. They were called coconuts by those who felt challenged intellectually. Uspiwo in KZN says African intellectuals are there. They continue to challenge the past and critique the present. The Dr. Kozas, the Masheles and Bijanas are the few who have been told to shut up. That's coming in from Spiwo in KZN. Mohammed from Ogaden says African intellectuals need to overcome war and conflict before they proceed to development. And Sachin Indenze SMSs and says the intellectuals decided to take a back seat because whenever they talk about their government's mistakes, they are criticized and called names. Zolile in Uppington says African intellectuals have conformed to capitalist system. They carry out class interests of capital. Those are just some of the SMSs coming in, and we'll continue to read out the SMSs coming in from you responding to our question, where are the African intellectuals? Currently, speaking is the former president of Nigeria, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo.
And I were doing things together, good things, mind you. One thing that struck me about this country was how, with your contributory pension and health insurance, you build up such magnificent resources for development of this country. And I follow suit because I believe that we should copy good things. I follow suit and I established contributory pension and health insurance. The contributory pension in Nigeria is less than 10 years old. About 2 weeks ago, they were telling me it's built up to $15 billion.
That's very good.
Let me take the second point I want to emphasize. We have to utilize all the human resources that we have. Politicians are good people, but so are academics, so are businessmen, so are farmers, so are traders, so are market women, so are students. How much do we make use of all these human resources? How much? And I believe that if we put all of them, if we use them properly and adequately and maximally, then they will add tremendously to. In fact, they are the resources that are not that we have that nobody should be able to take away from us. The third point I want to make is how do we work together? How do we work together nationally? How do we work together sub-regionally? And how do we work together continentally? Our brother who gave the introductory remark dwelt heavily on NEPAD, APRM, and AU and its constitutive act. The other day when NEPAD celebrated its 10th anniversary, I went out to give the background to NEPAD. And I said NEPAD was a child of circumstances that we find ourselves. And what were the circumstances? President Thabo Mbeki was the chairman of Non-Aligned. The Non-Aligned movement asked him to go and meet the G7+1. It was G7+1 then. And put across to them the plight of most members of Non-Aligned movement. President Bouteflika was the chairman of OAU then. OAU asked him to go to G7+1 and give the plight of African countries. I found myself as chairman of G77 plus China. And G77 plus China gave me the same mandate. And separately, the three of us found ourselves in Tokyo. The G7 gave us not up to 1 hour. Well, they just waved us off. They listened to us somehow, but not. So we three African leaders found ourselves representing 3 international organizations, giving us the same responsibility separately. And then we said to ourselves, here we are. What is Africa program? And we didn't have one that we can present as a continent. That was where our NEPAD began. President Thabo Mbeki, we mandated him to give us the leader. I contributed 1 person, and President Bouteflika contributed 1 person. And that was how NEPAD started. The confidence, the coming together, and utilizing the African resources. And we produced a document, a program that the international community decided to go along with. The fourth point that I want to make, and then I will stop, is that leadership matters. Part of our problem in the past is leadership was not adequate. And there are still signs of that when you look around, that leadership, inadequate leadership, still persists in Africa. And we cannot make the progress that we should make without adequate leadership. And as our brother who gave the introductory remark made, I believe Plato got it all right. A leadership that is only self-interested in itself, or in its kith and kin, or in its tribe, or only in its geographical area, cannot be a leadership to lead Africa. A leadership that will lead our nation must give himself completely to that nation. A leadership that will lead Africa must give themselves entirely and unstintingly to Africa. We must move away from received ideas, received solutions to our problem, received prescriptions. All our ideas are here. All our solutions are here. All our prescriptions are here. It's just a question of putting them together by the leaders that can deliver. And let's make sure we get leaders that can deliver for us in Africa. And that is the way. And nothing short of that will get us there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Both yourself and President Chisano focused heavily on the question of leadership, and I would like us to tease that out further. President Mbeki, some opening remarks?
Thanks, Chris. Our chairperson for this evening, Mrs. Slopepam, did indeed report that we had invited the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, to come and deliver the lecture this evening. And indeed, as she said, some urgent problems arose, and so he couldn't come. He was coming for the Diaspora Summit tomorrow, so he can't come even for that. I'm mentioning this again because a debate then ensued within the foundation. What do we do? We no longer have a lecturer. But we still have Africa Day. So what do we do? I was in Khartoum when this problem arose. You know President Obasanjo, in some year, can't remember what year it was, Shank. I was in Malaysia, and Gosum Teles was the acting president. And the problem arose in Lesotho.
Yeah.
So the people in my office, Frank Chikane and the others, would phone and say, look, there's this problem in Lesotho. What do we do? I would say, no, there's an acting president. Talk to him. And he ordered the South African army to go into Lesotho. I'm pleading not guilty to that one. He is the one that's guilty. No, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because then I'm saying we're in Khartoum, and I said, well, we've got the other members of the foundation at home. Let them solve this problem. And they took a very important and a very correct decision. I'm saying this, Chris, because here, President Pires, President Sanu, President Obasanjo here, these are comrades. We come from the same liberation struggle. And when they were told, day before yesterday, that here is a problem that's arisen now, you've got to go there, they promptly agreed. All of them. Which is why they are all here. I really want to say thank you very much to them and relate this to the point that President Pires made. When he said we must distinguish between independence and liberation. Does independence mean we are liberated? And he said it's not the same thing. These are liberators. These are liberators, you see, and we are celebrating, again, as President Chissano was saying, and our speakers, Bani and Mandla, the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the AU. And I think, in reality, the AU was raising this question that President Pires has just raised. Here we are, so many decades of independence, but are we liberated? And we said, one of the things that needs to be done, let's change from this OAU into an AU, not just a change of name, but for the AU to focus on the matter of liberation. The entirety of Africa is now independent, but is it liberated? Hence all the points that everybody has been making. For us to generate our own ideas, to use our own human resources, to cooperate among ourselves. And it was during this period of the African Union that you find all of these things like NEPAD, like the Peace and Security Council, the Constitutive Act, all of these things, to address this matter of the liberation of Africa. A matter that we have to deal with in that context is what is the role of these liberators? They are now unemployed. And therefore likely to get up to all sorts of mischief. But what is it that we do to inspire them into this continuing struggle for the liberation of the continent? Because we can't afford, as a continent, we can't afford to lose this experience and this commitment. And it's proven, it's not a theoretical commitment. We can't afford to lose it, but what is that we do to keep them engaged in what must be a continuing struggle for liberation, which liberation must then address the matter of the genuine independence of the continent, not just that the flag is flying, we've got a national anthem, but the substance of it. So I wanted to say thank you very much to them, and I think as South Africans, we're very, very glad indeed that we have this possibility to celebrate Africa Day with so many of our leaders. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. President. I give you my assurance I'm going to come to the audience and to students to ask some very critical questions, and you are protected by the chair. Please ask them very critical questions. Let me just throw out 4 questions to our presidents and ask them to be very crisp and brief about it. By the way, Chief Buthelezi, the president. Nkosi Buthelezi, the president did not... The president did not remember, but it was in 1998 when he decided to go and leave you with the Lesotho issue. It was in 1998. That was the year. Mr. President, come on, let me start with you, President Mbeki, and ask you this. Our liberation, more than 100 years old, if you take at least one of the key starting points in our history, our negative history, when European leaders descended on the city of Berlin in 1884-85, has gone through a number of epochs. 1900, W.B.E. Du Bois, 1945, another key Pan-African Congress, a pivotal moment, the establishment of the OAU. President Obasanjo, your government was very instrumental in it with Professor Adedeji, the establishment of sub-regional organizations in the continent. We had to forge structural adjustment. We had to fight, listen carefully, colleagues, esteemed members, the Washington Consensus during the 1980s and 1990s. Some people say we now have to deal with the Beijing Consensus. My question, President Mbeki, is there an African consensus? Is what we started in that very key period, President Obasanjo, 1998, 99, 2000, the formation of NEPA, the OAU. Is there an African consensus? So one question. Another way to put the question is, what is the African agenda? What is it that we are seeking? President Chisano, to you, sir, and this is not a question about reflecting on current serving leaders at all, and I think we must be clear about that, but what are these leadership challenges that we are facing, not just at the level of governments, but in society, amongst academics, intellectuals, the business people. And President Pires, I remember reading about your country and even your own period as president. And one of the things that stood out so vividly about your own period was how you emphasized the role of the state. How do we bring the African state back in? After these four questions, I will open up. President Mbeki.
Chris, you said we should be succinct. Succinct.
But they're having a debate here about whether it's succinct or succinct.
Is there an African consensus? Yes. That's it. Finished. No, Professor Pichana, for instance, mentioned, as President Obasanjo just said, the Consecutive Act. Mm-hmm. That's a very important instrument. It's an important document reflecting that African consensus. What makes it particularly important is because it actually had to be approved by the African parliaments in order to come into force. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just a document so that these African leaders sit there in Addis Ababa or somewhere, negotiate this thing, sign it, and so on. It actually had to be referred to the various African parliaments, our parliament debated it and adopted it. The Constitutive Act is actually South African law. Not just law for the AU, it's law in this country, as it is in many other countries. It reflects a very important consensus around many issues. Issues of economic development, issues of women's emancipation, including issues of the protection of children, of peace and security, of democracy, of human rights, all of this. And it's binding. It's binding on all of us. It's got provisions within it which allow the union to act, to enforce this Constitutive Act. I'm mentioning only that because you said we must be short. But I think it encompasses a whole variety of areas of African life. There is consensus. The question that you should ask is not so much whether there's consensus or not, is whether we, as individual African countries, then indeed act according to this consensus. Right. Or we are just happy to meet on Africa Day to say, long live the consensus, and then nothing happens. Thanks.
Thank you. President?
Well, you asked, do we have a program? Do we have an agenda? Do we have anything that we can see as something to drive us collectively and individually? Of course, I will come back again to the Constitutive Act of the AU. It's in many respects different from the OAU Charter. And one is the point that President Thabo Mbeki made. We had to take it to our national assemblies for endorsement. So it's not just a law for the AU or the Constitutive Act of the AU, it's also a law for Nigeria. And that's why some of the things that we are able to do by the AU, they couldn't do it in the OAU when Liberia had problems. The negotiation and all the things were done under the auspices of AU. And when we had to persuade Charles Taylor to come out, it was President Thabo Mbeki as the new chairman of AU and President Tiksano as the outgoing chairman of OAU, of AU, that went to Liberia to bring Charles Taylor to Nigeria. The OAU could not have done that. And the AU was able to do that because of the Constitutive Act of the AU. Now, one thing that also we must really take very, very dearly is the NEPAD. AU or Africa never had any document or any program that can be owned as an African program, as an African document, where you see, look at it, and you see what you can do as a country. It lays out the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, the educational, every aspect of our life as a nation, as a community, as a society, and as a continent, as a people, are all there. Now, it doesn't also say, look, when South Africa does it this way, Nigeria must do it that way. It leaves us, it gives us targets, objectives, and leaves us to follow our own way of doing it, just to achieve common objective. If you like, unity of purpose. And that is a common program for Africa. The question is, are we following that program? Now, if we are not following that program, what should we do to follow that program? As I said, at the 10th anniversary of NEPAD, I was there. And the consensus is that NEPAD needs to be energized. NEPAD needs to be invigorated. NEPAD needs to be driven. And that is what we have to ask the incumbent leaders to do.
We are coming to you live from the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture for 2012. The theme being Africa and the New World Order, Challenges and Opportunities. This is the Talk Shop with me, Masachaba Moshweshwe, on SAFM 104 to 107. Of course, as I mentioned earlier on, this is the 10th year anniversary of the formation of the African Union. The African Union was formed in 2002 in July in Durban, and 2002 was also the year that the G8 adopted an action plan on Africa. We are talking about the African consensus. Maybe the question we should be asking is there clarity with regard to the African consensus or African agenda? We are joined currently by the Principal and Vice Chancellor at UNISA, Professor Makhanya, who spoke earlier on, welcoming guests on behalf of UNISA. And UNISA has a partnership with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, thus the formation of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute that is based at UNISA right here in Pretoria. And he joins us at this particular moment during the lecture to just give us his thoughts on the lecture so far, but also the role of UNISA in transforming African society and contributing to the dialogue around the African agenda or African consensus. Good evening to you, Professor Makhanya, and thank you so much for joining us, and Dada, welcome onto the Talk Shop.
Maschaba, good evening, and thank you to our listeners.
Tell us about the significance of this partnership between the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation.
Thank you. The partnership between UNISA and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation is a critical one in the life of our university, in the sense that that partnership gave birth to what we currently know as the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. The good news about the birth of this new institute is that for the first time we tapped into the opportunities that are provided by the stature of the patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, that is former President Thabo Mbeki himself, and the kind of leadership which is African in orientation as well as in display, but also in action, which in our view needs to begin to help us to understand that being African, in fact, is a good thing, that people should not be scared of, should not shy away from, should not feel less than others, should acknowledge the fact that they are as human as any other human being from anywhere else in the world. Simply because we need to understand that colonization over the years, in a sense, dealt us a serious blow in beginning, to develop within us as an Africans an understanding as well as acknowledgement that we are, in fact, not as fully human as others are, which in a way tended, to even undermine the manner in which we conduct ourselves, but also what we believe we are capable of doing. And for this reason, it created dependence, not only in the context of how we educate, but also in the context of that which we are supposed to be taking leadership of. That at all those levels, we discovered that as Africans, we assumed that, in fact, it is those colonizers who, in fact, must continue providing for us, providing leadership for us, providing food, and, of course, ruling, as it were, but from a distance, rather than ruling directly within our own countries. It was a tragedy. That is why you've heard the former presidents here arguing that much as we fought for independence on the continent, it became apparent prior to the establishment of the African Union that in fact we're nowhere nearer a point of being liberated. And that departure then, which resulted in the establishment of the African Union, was a clear commitment that as a continent we must begin to introspect and then interrogate all these challenges that are facing us with a clear view that now we are going to be making progress, which in a way then was included in the Constitutive Act of this African Union. And the departure is very clear because specific programs of action were put in place for us as a continent to pursue so that we can change our lot for the betterment of the lives of the people of the continent. Now, we were then saying that it is indeed true that this will not just happen on its own. It will happen only if all of us, individually and collectively, work towards this development and growth of our development, or of our continent. You see, because the challenge really that we've been facing is that people, as a result of this oppression, for an extended period of time, have lost sight of what being a responsible citizen means. That it is others that will be doing it for me. We've seen even the challenges of dependence that you find as a result of these long, decades of subjugation, that at the point when we are supposed to be working hard as Africans to support our own organizations and our own institutions and our own state as active citizens to improve our lot, we are in fact doing the opposite. That no, it is not our responsibility. We have government that we've elected, and therefore it is the responsibility of government. That's where the problem comes in, because being a citizen means that we are supposed to be part and parcel of that development. So the extent to which the question of liberation begins to shape the way in which we understand ourselves and live out our own independence will make a difference, because then we'll be there. Will be called upon all the time to be present and to make the necessary contribution.
Who then should be setting this consensus? Who then should be setting this agenda with regards to how we define ourselves? Because obviously issues of identity are very much part and parcel of that. His Excellency Obasanjo spoke about the persistence of inadequate leadership in Africa. Who then should be setting the agenda for us as Africans, and what spaces should we be as citizens of Africa setting this agenda for ourselves?
I must say, Ms. Chaba, that to be honest, the agenda has already been set. All that remains is for us to understand that the space has been created and taken advantage of that space. The problem, as I indicated earlier, has to do with the fact that we've been blinded to the reality that is actually around us within our own environment. And for that reason, we actually cannot see that which provides possibilities for our own successes. We do not see the spaces that are provided for us, to bring about opportunities for us to take charge of our own activities with a view of making the contribution in our own societies, starting within our own communities, empowering one another, venturing into the programs that are going to be of value to society, but also being there to ensure that our new generations are in fact mentored properly within the context of our own values as Africans that bring about the question of respect, discipline, and understanding of what it means to lead, and the responsibility that we have over those that we are leading, which is part and parcel of what can in fact help us to succeed. Now we find that the manner in which we lead is tainted by the poison of colonization. Mm-hmm. That is why you'll find people saying that, the bad things about colonization are still here to haunt us, because we have not really succeeded to shake those shackles, from being prisoners to that kind of challenge. So in a sense, we just cannot make progress, because we are held to ransom by those kinds of challenges which have been there for a very long time. Now, we are saying we are an institution of higher learning. Mm-hmm. How do we then begin to understand ourselves in the context in which the former philosophers like Plato and so on argued the role of an intellectual is? You'll remember that in those good old days, that the manner in which these debates of intellectual life were held, where people actually would go to stadia, in order to have these debates and so on, which was in fact a very good part of the lives of the citizens of the country to understand what it meant, to go through liberation, what it meant to become a citizen and so on. You see, because those things are necessary. Mm-hmm. So we tend to take too many things for granted. And then complain about people actually not responding appropriately because we don't seem to succeed to pull them along with us. Yet the problem really remains at the level of the fact that they do not know what we're expecting of them. So they don't understand that independence means that they are free. That independence means that they've actually succeeded to move out of the shackles, that we found ourselves over centuries and so on. Now, because the institutions then do not understand their role, they have, in fact, in the process, rendered us, as countries within this continent, fail to take an advantage of the opportunities that are supposed to be pursued in the context of what this Constitutive Act of the African Union has brought, within our reach.
We're talking to Professor Makhanya, who is UNISA's principal and vice chancellor, and we are taking your calls 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207. He's making his observations with regards to the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Memorial Lecture that is currently underway right here in Pretoria at UNISA. 0891 104 207 for your thoughts, or you can SMS us on 34701. SMS number is 34701. That's our SMS number, and SMSs are charged at R2. Professor Makhanya, you talk about the shackles of colonialism, and this is something that comes up all the time. Even the impact of apartheid on the South African psyche, something that cannot be overlooked. But every time these issues are raised, we are then told as Africans that we are suffering from a victim mentality, that we want to blame somebody or something for our own inadequacies, our own failings. How do we draw attention, or at least get this shackles of colonialism on the agenda for South Africans, all South Africans, to understand where it is we're coming from and what is necessary to move forward?
I can say, Ms. Chaba, let's acknowledge our weaknesses. That's the point of departure. Let's acknowledge our weaknesses. Let us acknowledge our failures. And on those bases, then begin to spell out for ourselves how we're going to be moving forward. You see, because it is true that the challenge that is facing us is that we really can't cry foul of apartheid and colonialism forever.
Absolutely.
We've reached a point as a result of the advent of the African Union where we've been called upon as citizens to indeed take charge of our lives and move on from where things are. I mean, what President Pires actually was saying, that the most frustrating experience that he has had in his own country, in Cape Verde, is what has made us, after so many years, to fail to provide for ourselves as countries on this continent, to fail to be innovative in order to change our own circumstances, to fail to take leadership for our own education, to fail to provide leadership, to be productive for the sake of building our own economies, to fail on virtually everything. He says that it's simply because we've not understood that we need to leap forward. So there needs to be a quantum leap from where we are currently to a point where acknowledging our own capabilities is supposed to be driving the manner in which we conduct ourselves. It's only on that day that we shall actually call ourselves winners, who understand that we are on this road to liberation.
In the build-up to that day, when we're all on the same page, when we're all in the same bus, so to speak, and following the same agenda, how then should we be celebrating commemorative days like Africa Day? Tomorrow is Africa Day. We are talking about celebrating the 10th year anniversary of the formation of the African Union this year. How should we be celebrating these milestones?
Well, I can make reference to what former President Mbeki said, that let us not be judged by the fact that we have a flag reflecting that we are independent, and therefore pushing our hands in the air to say, "Hooray, we are very excited about being an independent nation or independent nations." But what we should rather be doing is that we use opportunities of these commemorative days to take stock of these challenges that are confronting us with a clear view of ensuring that we change our circumstances in order to better the lives of our own people and ourselves. Because the institutions that we have must understand their roles. That is why I was saying earlier that the tragedy really on the continent is that because we don't understand that we have roles to play, we are in fact our worst enemies. Our own governments, of course, find it very difficult, to invite all these constituencies to participate, because the understanding is that we know that we are free. Because we know that we are free, the understanding is that we are going to be claiming the space that is actually there for us and so on. But of course, it is not happening. And across the continent, the problem that consistently worries everyone else is at what point are we going to be having citizens who understand their right to citizenry? Once we at least jumped that one, we'll have made some progress.
I want to take some callers. I've got Philip in Mthatha, SFM listeners who have been listening to the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day annual lecture and listening to Professor Makhanya, UNISA Principal and Vice Chancellor, wanting to comment on the speeches that were made, the comments by the former presidents, former president of Mozambique, former president of Cape Verde, former president of South Africa, as well as former president of Nigeria. Philip in Mthatha, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening. I'm very impressed and I believe it all. And I just want to ask a question. You people did mention that Mr. Julius Malema and I think his deputy are in the audience. I would just like to inquire about Mr. Mbeki's brother. I'm not quite sure of the name. I think it's
Mweleti. Yes, indeed.
Yes.
What would you like to inquire about him?
Is he in the audience?
Okay. That's Philip in Mthatha asking if Mweleti Mbeki was in the audience. I'm not so sure about that. I think we observed those as they were walking in, and I don't remember us seeing Mweleti Mbeki, although he could have gone in when we did not notice. So it is quite possible. Gift and PE, good evening to you and welcome.
Hi, Mas Chaba, and hi to the professor. Look, quickly, I think I was quite impressed with the articulation made by our former president, Comrade Thabo Mbeki, in particular when he posed the question, where are the African intellectuals? And I think we have to ask that question every time. But lastly, I think institutions like your Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, your George Chikam, your Joam Chisano Leadership Institute will also inculcate this culture where young professionals, in particular African professionals, would be inculcated to respect their Africanness, but also to play a role in making sure that in the next 10 to 15 years, we've got brighter leaders who lead Africa in all the institutions of government so that we have this ethical leadership that will be an exemplary to the youth, in particular youth like us who want to see a leadership that is bold, leadership that is decisive, leadership that cannot be patronized.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Gift in PE. Alfie and Ramsich, good evening to you and welcome.
Hello?
Dumela Alfie.
Hello?
Dumela Ndad.
Yes, we are.
You're on air?
Yeah, I'm on air.
Yes, Alfie.
It's Navari.
Oh, Navari, not Alfie. Sorry. Go ahead, Navari.
Yeah. How are you? How are you, Professor and Makhtab?
We're very well, sir. Go ahead, quickly.
Well,
Navari? Oh, okay. We've lost Navari there. I'm looking at some of the SMSs that were coming in. One spoke about African values. This one comes in from Port Shipston, Prof, and it says, I've heard the term African values, but no definition as to what those values are. How do we, and again it goes back to issues that we were talking about, African values, African leadership, African education. How do we make these part and parcel, which is part and parcel of African identity, available to the broader public so it becomes part of public discourse?
Yes. No, thank you, Ms. Chaba. I think that it's important to answer that question. African values, we hold them so dear because they are close to our hearts as Africans. African people from time immemorial have held these values which have sustained them, to this point. One of these being respect, one of them being discipline, one of them being integrity, one of them being excellence. Now, you'll find what actually traumatizes Africans is to be told that being inadequate is akin to being African. You know, the complete contradiction of what African values are all about. Now, it is incumbent then upon us, you know, as institutions of higher learning, to take charge of these particular opportunities that are lacking within our own societies. Because let's accept that African societies were disintegrating since colonization actually, you know, caught our continent. And for that reason, the passage of African values from one generation to another was obviously dealt a serious blow. So we must acknowledge now that we have a situation where even the environment of extended families, which at least held these units together, is no longer in place. So for that reason, we can then say we are not going to be playing our role in ensuring that Africans understand themselves and accept their own identities in the context of who they are and act in that particular fashion. Because you see, the lack of understanding of these values make them not to know what they're supposed to be doing. So I think insofar as the question has been raised, it's so important. I think it's absolutely right, our listener, to say that, well, what do we need to do? I think I need to say let all institutions, not only institutions of higher learning, let community organizations, let our non-governmental sectors, let our churches, let every constituent part of our communities play a role in society. Okay. Let us not just let our own people loose and assume that someone else actually has a responsibility.
Professor Makanya, we have to leave it right there. Thank you so much for your time, sir. That was Professor Makanya, UNISA Principal and Vice Chancellor, joining us right here at the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, taking place at UNISA at the ZK Matthews Great Hall.
Thank you very much.
This is the Talk Shop with me, Masachaba Mushweshwe, coming to you live from the annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, taking place at UNISA at the ZK Matthews Great Hall, where 4 former presidents form part of the panel talking about Africa and the New World Order challenges and opportunities. Present is former President of Nigeria, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo, former President of Mozambique, His Excellency Joaquim Chissano, former President of Cape Verde, His Excellency Pedro Pires, and former President of South Africa, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, talking about the African agenda, talking about the African Union and NEPAD and the African consensus. The discussion continues, and we will try in future to bring you relevant guests who are present here tonight to give you a wrap-up of what came out of this discussion that, as I said, is currently underway as we speak. And that brings us to the end of the show this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for the SMSs. Very robust debate around African intellectuals, and I think that is something that we will carry through into studio, into the programs that we bring you as the Talk Shop right here on SAFM. Thank you so much to our team, Tulufelo Bilu, as well as our executive producer, Buli Jawa, right here at UNISA, and our technical producer, Kagiso, also joining us this evening. And stand by in the studio, Umulemo Maja and Wandile Makasana, part of the technical team. Up next is the Enviro Show with Nancy Richards. Nancy?